Hello, everybody, and thank you for taking part in this online discussion. A big thank you to Olga Baysha. It's an hour later in Moscow for taking the time to discuss with us, to log in with us. For those who do not know, this discussion, this event will be held in English language only because Olga speaks English and her text for our book was originally written in English. So there is no translation to German tonight. My name is Stefan Kraft. I'm one of the two owners of Promedia Verlag, Promedia Publishing House in Vienna. And this spring, my colleague, Hannes Hofbauer, and I, we have edited a volume which you can see on the screen. And it is called, in German, Kriegsfolgen, wie der Kampf die Ukraine die Welt verändert. Or in English, it would translate to Consequences of War, how the fight over Ukraine changes the world. And there are about 16 different contributors to this volume, and Olga Baysha is one of them. And thankfully, she has contributed a text to this volume, which is titled Zelensky's Authoritarian Populism, From Peace to War. And we will talk about this chapter for like maybe half an hour and the implications of her text. And after that, you, the participants, will have the chance to discuss with Olga for Q&A, for questions and discussion. Olga, first of all, I would like to start with your biography. You are an associate professor in media and communications at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow.
Yes.
And you earned your Ph.D. from the University of Colorado at Boulder in the United States. But before all that, you were born in Kharkiv, as you say, as an ethnic Ukrainian.
Yes.
And you worked for Ukrainian television as a journalist for quite a long time, from 1991 to 2008. So I would like to start with this era and why it came to a stop. So maybe what can you tell us about the political changes you experienced in your time as a journalist in these years? And maybe up to 2008 or 2014, what were the turning points and how it affected your work as a journalist?
So yes, I was born in Kharkov. In Russian, it is pronounced Kharkov. In Ukrainian, Kharkiv. No, it's okay. I mean that Kharkiv is a Russian-speaking city. So especially in previous times, so I was born under the Soviet Union, and under the Soviet Union, in the city, you would hardly hear any Ukrainian words. So the common language was Russian. I was studying in a Ukrainian school that was the only Ukrainian school in the whole city, the population of which was about 2 million people. So this school was located in the very center of Kharkov, and I had to travel to the school and back home for about 40 minutes every day here and there, because in addition to Ukrainian language, the school was teaching English from the first class. So that's why my parents decided that I should study at this school, and not so many people wanted to study in Ukrainian. So in an ordinary class, normally there would be like 44 students. In my class, there were 23 students. So the idea of studying in Ukrainian was not popular at all. But I was learning Ukrainian, and it helped me because I was, then I decided, due to family reasons, I decided to be a student of the Crimean University. And I went to Crimea, and because Crimea was part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, I demanded to take my exams in Ukrainian. So a special committee was created. That was 1983. A special committee was created in that Crimean University to allow me to pass exams in Ukrainian. They didn't pronounce a word during my exam. They were just listening because it was difficult for them to speak Ukrainian. And because of that, I was accepted to university without any competition because they just put highest grades for everything and I passed. So the Soviet Union, this is a very interesting thing. It was not as bad as many people imagine. As a matter of fact, nowadays, you cannot imagine such a situation with respect to Russian language. You will not be allowed to pass exams using Russian in contemporary Ukraine. So this is a kind of a tricky thing. Then I returned to Kharkiv, and after my graduation from the university in Kharkiv, I was invited to work at television station in 1991. That was like the first year of Ukrainian independence. All previous media companies were under, communist control, under state control. And in 1991, the abundance of independent new media appeared, and they were lacking professional journalists. And so they were invited everybody, actually, adventurers, young adventurers who wanted, to express himself, herself, whatever. And so I was one of them. I didn't understand anything about this life, the complexity of our social transformation. We imagined ourselves as avant-garde, leading our society to a better Western-like future. And I was working at the journal. The more I worked as a journalist, the more I started questioning myself. To what extent do we have a right to represent our society? We were so young and ambitious, without a proper knowledge. So I worked quite a lot. In 2000, I decided to make master's degree. It was Colorado State University because I had many questions regarding all these kind of propaganda things, journalism things. So I finished my master's degree in Colorado State University. I returned to Ukraine and I was working in a documentary production studio in Kyiv. So I moved to Kyiv. And that was actually for the first time in my life that I started realizing to what extent we were different. We're extremely different. People in Kyiv could not understand, not my language. Language is okay. But they could not understand, for example, why so many people in the east of Ukraine are so friendly to Russia, why so many people in the east of Ukraine are nostalgic about the Soviet times, and so on and so forth. So there were many, issues that we could not find common language about. And then the Orange Revolution of 2004 happened, and I was in Kyiv. That was really a decisive point for me, because I realized that we're not simply different. We cannot find common language. We could not. We had terrible disputes in my television studio. People from the west of Ukraine could not understand people from Donbass and so on and so forth. So that's why I decided ultimately to start my Ph.D. program in critical media studies in the University of Colorado at Boulder. So I was I'm finishing now, I'm too talkative. So I was specifically interested in ideology, in cultural studies, in all these kind of critical views on society. So that's why I came to doctoral studies.
Mm-hmm. And what affected your work as a journalist during these times? So why did it stop in 2008?
In 2000, so as I told you already, so I was so much interested in all these complexities in our social life. So that's why I decided to start my PhD program. And after I finished my PhD program, I decided not to work as a journalist because actually, to be honest, I came to the conclusion that all journalists, no matter where it is, in the United States, in Europe, or in Russia, or in Ukraine, for me, that it didn't matter, because all journalism exists within some discourses. Discourse is my field of study. So some normalized assumptions. People working in some journalistic fields, they share similar assumptions. And the only way for me to ask really serious questions about our, state of thinking, about how we think, is to go to academia and to make academic inquiries about what's going on. And that's why I decided to stop with my journalistic career. So that's why I decided to be in academia.
Okay. You are author of many books, and one of them is called Democracy, Populism, and Neoliberalism in Ukraine on the fringes of the virtual and the real. The chapter in your book focuses especially on Zelensky and Zelensky's regime. Would you say that this was a neoliberal turn in Ukraine, or was the neoliberal turn before? And what were the specific economic measures that came with this regime?
The neoliberal turn started in Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Ukraine became an independent state, and that was the beginning of all the neoliberal reforms that were presented to Ukrainians not as neoliberalism. Nobody, I mean, not so many people in Ukraine even now understand this word, but all these economic transformations from the collective property, for example, to private property, they were conducted under the banner of civilizing Ukraine. This is just a common way of presenting all this economic transformation. People were told that we need to be civilized. So we lived under the Soviet modernity, and it was a kind of a distorted state of things, distorted understanding of civilization. We were outside of civilizational route. And so now we should, catch up with the whole of civilization as represented by the West. That was the beginning. But when, all the years after Ukraine obtained independence, all the years we were following this route. But when Zelensky came to power, that was a very interesting turn, because this is what I'm investigating in my book, is because Zelensky, his political platform before the election, it was not an ordinary political platform. It was not an ordinary promise. He did not give a lot of pre-election interviews. He produced his television series as a comedian. He was a famous comedian, and he performed like a fictional leader of the state. And in this television series, it lasted for about 3 years. He told the Ukrainians, actually, as his hero, that he would again civilize Ukraine by means of fighting against corruption. He didn't tell a word about further privatization of state enterprise. He didn't pronounce a word about any reform in the educational sphere, the eradication of state institutions, and so on and so forth. But when he came to power, so what happened? This is what I'm analyzing in the book. So people believed him because he's a nice guy, he's a funny guy, he's a very attractive guy, and he presented this wonderful populist story in his television series. There are wonderful, good Ukrainians and bad oligarchs, bad elites. So he would come to power, he would imprison these bad elites, and Ukraine would become prosperous. He did not explain how he would achieve this. He didn't, which is very interesting, in his series, he never told a word about the ongoing war in the Donbass, because that was a very difficult issue for the Ukrainian society. People were divided on this issue. Half of Ukraine likes Russia, another half of Ukraine didn't like Russia. So not to jeopardize this imagined unity of his nation, he did not pronounce a word during his series about this war. So the name of the series was The Servant of the People, a very populist term. Then his party was created, the so-called party, because actually just a collective of all kind of people with different ideological views. For example, some people from his party believes in socialism, other people believe in libertarianism. There are some people who do not believe in anything. So that was a big collective of people without no ideological, leaning. And so 1 year before the presidential election of 2019, he created this party, and the name of the party became the Servant of the People, the same name as in the series. So this is, the fringe between the real and the virtual. So people believed in his character in the series. Then the party was created. Then he was elected the president. Then the party elected the parliamentary elections, and based on this party unimaginable success that was nobody could imagine it would happen. So based on this success, he created the parliamentary majority. So, and he didn't need any kind of coalition to take political decision in this parliament. And so on the third day after the new government was formed in the early September of 2019, the program of radical neoliberal reforms was adopted. And nobody, no political opponents could affect it because they did not need any coalition. So they created their own parliamentary majority. They did not need anybody to implement these radical reforms. And these reforms were, first of all, the most terrible thing was about land privatization, the implementation of land market. Up to 73% of Ukrainians were against this, but nobody listened to them any longer because the power in the country was under total control of Zelensky's party. And that was the trick which I'm analyzing in the book.
Mm-hmm. And you also call him a populist. So what, I mean, of course, he's a populist because he fights against corruption. That's one characterization, but were there any social populist demands that he used in the before he became president, or what kind of populism would you say was it?
In my book, I'm employing the theory of populism by Ernesto Laclau, according to, so I don't want to go into details of the structuralist analysis, but to put it simply, when you analyze his show, I mean, the series, he represents his vision of society. So society is split into two radically antagonistic fields. One is good people, another is bad elites. There is nothing in between. So all elites are terribly bad. All politicians are, puppets of oligarchs. There are no good politicians. All people who occupy power in Ukraine are bad people. So there are no shadows. There are wonderful Ukrainians, ordinary Ukrainians, and very bad elites. And because they are presented in this radically antagonistic, in their relation, so there are no political decision to deal with the differences. So the only decision is to imprison them. This is what he's actually offering. This is the political program as presented in his series. He is imprisoning political elites. He's imprisoning oligarchs. Some of them have to flee Ukraine. Their property is confiscated. And in the series, oligarchs actually pay off their prison terms to buy off debts from the International Monetary Fund. So it's just a radically simplistic way of thinking, but people liked it. I mean, that was funny, that was nice. What happened later, actually, Zelensky started to fight against opposition following this illegal route, because what we're observing in this series is a totally illegal way of dealing with the oligarchs, bad political elites, right? In the real life, after he won election, he started prosecuting, not immediately, but this happened in 2021, when he lost his popularity due to his radical reforms, due to land reform. Because of the land reform, in the beginning of 2021, the majority of people in Ukraine came to believe that Ukraine is moving into wrong direction. And when this happened, when his rating fell down to as low as 17%, he shut up oppositional channels. The first 3 channels were shut down in at the beginning of 2021, without regard to legality. So in a similar fashion as it was in his series, in his movie, they were shut up. And he presented this issue. He explained this to the nation as these media were like, pocket media of oligarchs. Actually, they belonged to oppositional party, Opposition for Life, and they were controlled by Medvedchuk. Medvedchuk's, the godfather of Medvedchuk's daughter was Putin. So that's why he was a bad guy. And that's why it was possible to shut down all oppositional channels.
And he shut down all oppositional channels before the war started?
Yes, that was January or February January or February, at the beginning of 2021, 1 year before, first 3 oppositional channels were shut down. Then a little later, the journalists from these oppositional channels created new channels, YouTube channels. They were shut down also. Then there was, and when I'm saying shut down, that was illegally done. That was done by the decision of the National Security Service of Ukraine. They don't have such a right. So only courts have a right to close somebody or to open something. So that was absolutely unconstitutional moves. But after these first channel, another channels came, and then Strana UA, and then Nash, the last oppositional channel, was shut down 2 weeks before the war started. 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm. So in our book, you present 2 examples of critical journalists in the Ukraine who were forced to stop their work and have been arrested at the beginning of the war or right after that. Can you tell us about them? How did they report the war? And how has the situation developed since you wrote your text? Because the text is from the end of 2022. Are they still under arrest?
This is an interesting question. Nobody knows. There are no public news about people who simply disappeared. So Jangirov, the one person who he was, nobody understands what happened, because what appeared in the screen on his YouTube channel is that he's sitting in front of the camera. He is dressed in an unusual manner. He's like, it was obvious that somebody is, is telling him how to behave, and he's condemning Russian special military operation. After that, he disappeared. So some people said he was arrested. Other people said he was kidnapped by radicals, but he disappeared. Simply, the person disappeared. There are no public news about him. Nobody knows. So this is Dmitry Zhangirov. Another person, I know these people personally. That's why I'm so confident. And I know some people who should know them, but nobody knows. So another person is Yuri Tkachov. He's from Odessa. He was arrested in March as well, March 22, 2022. Then he was released on bail in May. He pronounced some words to his audiences explaining that he was arrested because he is accused of this and that. After that, he disappeared as well. So no news about them. I don't know. Maybe they are okay. Maybe they are just forbidden to talk, but maybe not. Because in my book that is going to be published this month, a new book, I'm telling about some more cases in this respect. One of the cases is Andrei Wojciechowski from Kharkiv. I know Andrei from 1991 when I came to work in a Kharkiv television station. And Andrei Wojciechowski, he's an honored journalist of Ukraine. He is not a young person. He's an honored journalist. He was arrested. He was kidnapped by special services in May 2022. He spent about 2 months in Ukrainian prisons, and he was released after 2 months of being in prison. And he was not scared to put his account of what happened to him on YouTube. You can easily find it even now. It's impossible. It's terrible to hear what's going on in these prisons. Nobody cares. You know what is in the first 2 cases which you mentioned, people don't know. Okay, people disappeared, nobody knows. But in this case, his account is on YouTube. People can listen to what's going on in Ukrainian prison. It's terrible. Nobody cares. It exists and nobody cares. This is what terrifies me. It's just the normalization of this exclusion of others, and nobody cares.
Okay. You analyzed many of Zelensky's speeches up until the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And one point that you stress in your argumentation is that he uses a very narrow framework. You also talked about this, that in his view, for example, also to link the war with Western interests in any way is nothing else than Russia's disinformation thesis.
Yes.
but are there still voices in the Ukraine who dare to criticize NATO and the West?
Yeah. You can find it. I mean, I cannot, of course, I cannot provide an evidence now because I need to look at text. But in my book that is going to be published this month, I'm actually provide citations with references to his speeches. When I don't remember in what exactly speech, but he pronounces this, that anybody who blames NATO, anybody who blames the West, and so on, is Russia's agent. So it's as simple as that. So it's, as a matter of fact, after I published my book, not with you, but my previous book with Routledge, I read something in Ukrainian public sphere. Somebody wrote about my book is that, oh, of course. So I was paid by the Kremlin, and that's why. So it's as easy. It's simple. If you are saying something not along the lines that Zelensky or his authorities propagate, that immediately you are the Kremlin's agent. I wonder where is my money. So this is the only question that I have. But thanks God, I'm alive. Thanks God, I'm okay. I'm living now. But people are disappearing. You know, this is terrible, and nobody cares.
Okay. Maybe one last question. The participation of the far right in the Ukrainian governing bodies is something that is not really reflected or reported in the Western media, and is also overemphasized by Moscow. Also was used as a pretext for war. But you come from this country. You've worked there as a journalist for a long time. For you, how do you think, how far is the influence of the far right? Could you call it a far right regime right now in Ukraine?
Now, yes, but it was not that way. I can give you an example. When you take this Zelensky's unusual political platform as presented in his series, The Servant of the People, he himself, and he's the author of the script, he's the owner of the company who produced. So, and later in his interview, Zelensky said, I didn't invent this. This is what I felt. So these are his thoughts. And he presents the political environment in Ukraine as an environment controlled by radicals from both sides, pro-Russian radicals and right-wing radicals. And in his period, he portrayed these right-wing radicals as controlled by oligarchs. So actually, he understood everything. So Zelensky was part of society. He understood everything. Only when he came to power, I don't know what's going on behind the doors, of course, but what is obvious is that right-wing political, not parties, but right-wing forces, these radical activists, they are very active and they are scaring, you know, they are intimidating society. And as soon as, for example, as soon as Zelensky signed this, remember how it was called in English, in Paris, Normandia meeting,
Yes.
Paris, he signed his obligation to follow the Minsk Agreement and Steinmeier's formula in 2019. As soon as he did it, Kiev's radicals exploded with protests. They occupied streets and they demanded not to follow this route. And their demand was crystal clear. If you do this, we'll show you. And so there, if you look at the whole of Ukrainian society, the majority of people are, I mean, I would say normal in this, you know, they're not radicals, but radicals are very active. They are very active and they intimidate people. They do not allow people to speak. I mean, not all people, but if you are a teacher, if you are a seller in a shop, you know, a police officer, they would intimidate you. You need to speak Ukrainian. Otherwise, they would come to your shop, they would come to your school, they would come to your police station, and they will, you know, harass you. So they're very active and they are noisy, I would say, you know, they are everywhere. So they produce an impression that they control everything. And it's scary. You know what happened in Odessa in 2002, you know, that so many people were burned alive, you know, these anti-Maidan Ukrainians. People are scared. I know this, that all my relatives live in Ukraine. People are scared to pronounce a word against them because it's simply scary.
Okay. Now, thank you, Olga. We will now give the participants the possibility to have questions for you. You just need to switch on your microphone if you want to. So, maybe not. Okay. If there are no questions from the audience, maybe I can put the last question to you, which is quite a big one. But you talked a lot about the rise of Zelensky and his massive popularity, and then the downfall, and what he did against it. Obviously, now he's the war president. It's very popular. But if somehow a peace accord can be reached in the next month or years, what do you think are his chances to remain the president of the Ukraine?
They're low. Extremely low, extremely low. Actually, according to the constitution, we should have presidential elections in March 2024. But, Petro Poroshenko and Vitaly Klitschko, they already started mobilizing their political strength to fight against Zelensky. As soon as the war is over, and you know, when I pronounce this, I don't believe in this. Why? Because the war, I mean, the big war may be over, but it doesn't mean that hostilities would completely stop. We may have the situation as it was in Donbass during 8 years. Economic issues in Ukraine, you know, economy is devastated. You need to rebuild it. You need to bring Ukrainians back to Ukraine. But if you still have these hostilities, if you still have this terrible situation in the economic sphere, not so many people will return, and so on and so forth. So economic issues will overwhelm. And Zelensky is not the person who is able to deal with economic issues. His government is unprofessional. And everybody knows that. It's not because that, actually, you should understand me. It's not because I don't like Zelensky. Actually, I liked him. I liked him because he promised peace. And many people liked him because he promised peace and he didn't do this. No, it's not because he won't remain a president if the war is over. That's why he's afraid of making a peace deal. That was the end of him, at least political, but maybe even not.
Okay. Okay, thank you for these insightful last words.
We'll see.
Thanks everybody for participating.